Hi, it's Dave Michels from TalkingPointz. I'm here with Heidi Elmore. Welcome, Heidi.
Thanks for
We're going to
having
be
me.
talking. We're going to be talking about Enterprise Connect. Heidi, you've been to a lot of Enterprise Connects. I even recall you being on the keynote stage as a cast member on the Enterprise Connect years ago. I think it was a Skype for Business keynote. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think you're thinking about Ignite, but yes, I've definitely been to many enterprise connects and with a few different vendors. In fact, this was my first time participating not as a vendor. I think which was really eye-opening to me just to kind of see the breadth of the participation and the industry as well. So it was great.
Well, now you're like the like me, like one of the Muppets in the balcony, kind of being a critic on all this stuff, and so we're going to get to some of the interesting stories that we saw at Enterprise Connect. We're just going to hit a few. There was so much going on, but
Yeah.
but before we can do anything, I guess the first thing we have to talk about with Enterprise Connect is ChatGPT. It won Best of Show, and I don't even think they were even in the running, but. Did ChatGPT scream at you as you walked around as well?
It did. It did. I think that it was interesting to see how various vendors were integrating this new large language model, LLMs, foundational models into their messaging, into their products, and so forth. Um, I'm not sure if you got a chance to see a few of the keynotes, but I thought Google actually did the best job at articulating the different types of AI and really just kind of taking us all to school on what this all means. But yes, to answer your question, ChatGPT was certainly omnipresent at EC this year for sure.
I think it was just amazing because the technology, as far as we're all concerned, didn't exist more than 6 months ago, and
Yeah.
somehow became the headliner of this conference. I'm wondering what the vendors were all thinking 6 months ago. It's like, what are we going to do about Enterprise Connect? Because something will come up, I guess. And the other thing that kind of stood out to me is that. Most of the announcements around ChatGPT were beta announcements. A lot of them didn't have pricing yet. It's still not clear to me how useful this LLM technology is going to be in enterprise communications.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. In fact, just a few weeks before Enterprise Connect, we had the Magic Quadrant from Gartner get published on the enterprise conversational AI, and even just the late breaking news, I think, around ChatGPT didn't completely integrate it into that report, let alone
No.
Enterprise Connect. So it'll be interesting to see how the narrative progresses. But I think the overarching theme is stay tuned, especially on the pricing front.
The pricing front, and the other problem is that so much of what we know about conversational AI is how you have to train it on your data. And the big benefit of ChatGPT or the generative models is that you don't have to train it, but it's not on your data. And so how do we bridge that gap? I think is particularly the contact center, I think is still, stay tuned. It's going to be an interesting journey. Because as we know, everyone loves ChatGPT. I mean, if you don't have ChatGPT integration in your product, you're like nobody. I mean, that is so out of date. But let's get to some of these stories. I like to think of them as stories because we saw lots of little things going on, and one of the stories that I wanted to talk to you about was. I'm going to call it the future of enterprise comms, and so there was a lot of different vendors, a lot of different perspectives around what the future of enterprise comms is. In fact, you wrote about it about the Microsoft Cisco stuff. They think they got the future figured out. I think there's a strong narrative from a lot of vendors about Microsoft's going to be Teams is going to be number one. We're going to be number two. You hear that from 5 or 6. 7 or 8 vendors saying we're going to be number two, and they all have very interesting narratives, and I don't want to dismiss any of them. I think that's all interesting. But one of the stories that stood out to me came from Vonage, a self-proclaimed also ran a few years ago. They're not talking about being number two. They're talking about redefining enterprise communications completely. They had a breakout session, 7 in the morning, well attended, kind of surprising that they got that many people there at 7 in the morning.
Yeah.
And they're not talking about incremental improvements. They're not talking about better video or better APIs. They're talking about something very different. Now you had a chance to look at that. Why don't you summarize, or do you want me to summarize, or I don't know. You say something. How about that?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. I think what's really interesting about what Vonage is bringing to market in partnership with Ericsson, clearly there's some peanut butter and jelly, peas and carrots that goes on there, better together. I think what's really interesting is that they're going to transform, I think, a couple of discrete parts of the current enterprise comms industry. The first is, the one that they've been talking the most about, which is about the 5G APIs.
Yep.
It's funny. At first blush, you think, oh gosh, quality of service. How is that unique? Well, on unmanaged networks, it's always been a big problem on mobile devices, on unmanaged networks, and this ability to be able to expose the network layer as part of a CPaaS offering, I think is quite revolutionary. It's like all of a sudden we get the access and controls as a developer to, all these different capabilities that before were really, you had to be on your own private network in order to control. So I think that there's some really cool 5G scenarios out there. I think for this audience, video conferencing is obviously a front and center one, but start thinking about the gaming conversation. I know they did a demo of that, at Mobile World Congress. And there's got to be other high bandwidth scenarios out there where 5G is just and the exposure to things like quality of service control is going to be a game changer, frankly. I would say metaverse, but I think we've all agreed that metaverse might not be a thing anymore.
Yeah. I have to say, everything that they said at that 7 a.m. crack of dawn session made sense, and that may have been because I was asleep. But everything they said mostly made sense. Whether they could pull this off is a whole nother discussion. But what really stood out to me in that conversation is, well, one, the bravado, right? They're not talking about being number two. They want to be number one. They want to do other big things. They're thinking big. But a lot of things that they said, particularly Rory, the CEO, he talked about how waves build on each other. And so we saw the mobility wave, we saw the cloud wave, we saw the 5G wave, and always we look at these as isolated things. He talked about composable APIs. They're all kind of isolated trends, but they're putting them all together. And I think that's really interesting, and that kind of makes sense. And he's talking about a future of what he called multimodal communications across. And then I think he said it was discovery, commerce, support, and service. And so he's talking big words, right? He's using a lot of terms from 5G that I'm not that familiar with. He's been hanging out with the Ericsson guys, and he's talking a slightly different vocabulary. But I love the way that he was presenting this as it's all kind of a natural progression. And so they're taking and if you think about what happened in the last wave with cloud, the network providers lost out. They have no way of monetizing over the top. They can't monetize Teams unless they sell Teams. All they're selling is pipes, and don't tell them that because they hate selling pipes. And so, but if that's all you can monetize is selling pipes, that's all you can monetize. And so Vonage is saying, why don't we give them the ability to control their pipes with APIs and quality of service and location information and authentication and things like that. And then they can make money on all these API calls. And it's like, well, gosh, they're going to love that. That kind of makes sense. And that can be done with a new network like 5G. And I kind of see where they're all coming together. It's effectively a next-gen CPaaS, which to me makes a lot of sense. And then you wrote about this, Heidi. You wrote about their Mobile World Congress thing. They had Telefonica, Orange, and Vodafone, all companies that don't normally agree with each other, kind of like nodding their head.
They were all around the same campfire, like singing Kumbaya together. I mean, it's kind of funny, right? And to your point, I mean, now these providers are going to have the ability to realize consumption-based revenue, which I don't think that really they've been exposed to that kind of model before, which will be really interesting.
All right. Well, there were other companies that had interesting narratives too. I'll just throw what was a bandwidth at Maestro, which was also another network play. But we had a few other interesting narratives. But that Vonage one kind of stood out to me. Let's go to another story here. I want to talk a little bit about CCaaS, because everyone knows Enterprise Connect is a CCaaS conference. One of the stories that I wasn't quite expecting that kind of came to the top was I don't even know what to call it. You call it WFO, WFM, WEM. I don't even know what to call it. But this really boring software that's always kind of accompanied CCaaS is somehow coming to the top, rising to the top. There were three major announcements. There was UJet, which I wrote about on No Jitter, which they acquired authority, and they created a new version of their WFO software for UJet and for Google CCAIP. Google also, in their keynote, which you just mentioned, talked about how they're going to work with Verint. And then Zoom, Zoom comes out and says, hey, we have a WFO too. We just built it. And not only is it great, but not only is it great with Zoom, but you can even buy it standalone and use it with other companies. And it's like, well, wow, I wasn't expecting that one at all. And so all of a sudden, this WFO, WEM, whatever thing is kind of important. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's clearly early days for, the Googles and Zooms of the world, who have talked about their entry into this space. But then they've also been talking about, for example, on the Zoom side, Calabrio just announced, that they're a certified partner, or on the Google side, as you mentioned, that Verint is still a certified partner. So I think it's early days. It's not surprising that they're trying to enter into these spaces. I think, if you look at scheduling is still like front and center to WFM. If you look at a lot of their other announcements on the meeting side and the recording capabilities, that dovetails quite nicely into quality management. So bubbling that all the way up into like a pure WFO offering. I think there's a lot of really logical progression when it comes to entering into those new markets. Time will tell how all these new players can, continue to compete with other pretty staunch competitors. I mean, NICE, for example, started in that space, right? And then they branched out into contact centers. So
they're the only one going the other way, right? They went into CCaaS. Every CCaaS company seems to be going into WFO. What do you think of, I mentioned the three announcements. Two of them were Google. Google now has two WFO tools, one from UJet and one from Verint. What do you think what do you think they're communicating to us? Read between the lines on that one.
Well, I think in the contact center, it's especially with all these flavors of conversational intelligence, you've got to be able to have access to the data. And in a contact center, where's the best source of data? Well, it's WFO, right? It's not just the recordings of the interactions between your employees and your customers. It's also, potentially chat records. It's also, it's that fundamental transition from a contact center to customer experience where you've got a 360-degree view of your interaction. So, and that is indeed where, many of the hooks, at least, to those customer records exist. So it actually makes sense because it's going to be hard for all these vendors to build the contact center or the experience center of the future without access to that data.
All right, well, let's get on to story number 3, our final story for this particular video. The future of meeting rooms, and it appears to involve multiple cameras. We heard multiple camera announcements basically from Microsoft, Cisco, and Zoom, and Crestron wasn't even there, but I got the briefing on Crestron's multi-camera solution from their acquisition called One Beyond last month. And so that's 4 vendors that have decided that now is the time for multi-camera solutions in meeting rooms. Do you agree with that, Heidi?
It's interesting, and it all goes back to why multiple cameras. And I think the why is that the far end, or the people participating remotely, need to be able to, see the, whites of your eyes in the clearest way possible. And, we've seen that evolution over time, right? So I'm sure you remember the old Polycom Eagle Eye Director, right? With the first foray,
that was groundbreaking.
They had that nice little mic array, 2 cameras, pan, zoom, tilt, like figure around the room.
You list mic array kind of as just a feature, but that was what it did. This is before any kind of visual AI technology. So it used the microphones to figure out who was talking, and it wasn't actually multi-camera. It just moved the camera to the right person based on where they were talking. And then I guess slowly that improved to a visual-based AI. But yeah, that was the start of that. The virtual cameraman.
Exactly. And then we evolved to more of a, multi-stream. So, hey, I've got 4 people in the conference room. Again, I'm a remote participant and I want to be able to see everybody. So that's where, these multi-stream capabilities came in. We saw that with Intelligent Camera from Microsoft, Smart Gallery from Zoom. And then I think that was somewhat of the precursor.
That was pretty recent. That was like last year. Yeah, that was pretty recent. And then again, that was one camera, but it was turned into it would basically have multiple feeds coming out of one camera, multiple zooms. Very clever technology. But again, yeah, it's an important part of the progression. I think that's a good point.
Very, and also super processor intensive. So, it can only be certified by certain hardware manufacturers. And so I think it's a natural progression to maybe instead of having these, dedicated, pretty expensive cameras to go to more of a multi-camera approach, which allows you to cover more of the room. I think we've all been in spaces where, you've got 2 sides of the table, and instead of seeing someone's profile from the camera view, maybe it would make more sense to have one on one side wall, one on the other. The challenge is that I think we're seeing hardware vendors try to tackle this problem differently. And I think you and I both are in agreement on some of the options that are out there. But, I think Hudley's one that's doing some interesting work. Logi is doing some work in that space. In fact, I think you have an opinion on that one.
Well, the Logi one, I think that was one of the first ones I saw. And what's it called? I can't think of the name of it. It's not Sight. What is it called? Sight?
It's called Sight, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so the Logi Sight camera.
Version called Movo.
So what's interesting with the Logi one is it goes on the tabletop, and they can't, and you can't move them once on the tabletop because they have to know where they are for the software to work right. Yeah. And I've got basically 2 issues with that. One is, I like to have my tabletop available. Sometimes I got a big piece of paper. Sometimes I got something to put down, and I just don't like the idea that these things are going to be on the table that can't be cleared away. But the other thing is that I think the trend, and you just talked about this with the multi-stream cameras. The trend is cameras are getting invisible. They're getting smaller. You don't know. I mean, even the eagle eye you mentioned earlier, you could hear it pan and tilting and making all this noise and all this stuff. And cameras are getting silent. They're becoming digital. They're doing all their special effects with software, and they just kind of disappear. And the idea of putting all these cameras on the table, I feel kind of is contrary to that one. But one of the issues is that we've seen huge progress, and you wrote about this as well, in interoperability in meeting rooms. And this is going to be a new branch of that's not interoperable. So if you, the Logi site, as we just talked about, that's really designed for a Microsoft environment. So if you decide to use that equipment for a different meeting that's not on Microsoft, I'm not sure what those cameras do anymore. And it's going to be the same with actually every solution. Every solution's got some sort of proprietary way of using these multiple cameras. So in some ways we're going backwards, but I also agree that it's a natural progression. It's a natural evolution to get to this multi-camera place.
Yeah, and I mean, let's not forget about Cisco. They had a big announcement here at the show, right, with their cinematic meeting experiences, which one of the things I liked, and I hope I'm remembering this correctly, is that IT or room administrators can actually designate what parts of the rooms are different zones, which I thought was interesting, and potentially instead of just leaving it to the hardware, also providing some service level logic to it, which I think is probably a good mix of all of the different tech.
Yeah, it's one of the problems with AI, and it goes back to the ChatGPT stuff. I mean, the AI really doesn't know what it's doing. It's just kind of doing what it thinks it's supposed to be doing. When you ask ChatGPT a question, it gives you a great answer. It sounds like, wow, it's brilliant, but it has no idea what it, I mean, it's playing name that tune with words, just kind of like this word should follow that word. But and so giving it more territory, this is a territory, this is a zone, I think is really going to be much more helpful than people realize. But what I can't figure out from all this technology in the meeting room I can't figure out if this is a boardroom feature, for your high-end fancy boardroom, or is it an any room feature? And we would, especially with the hybrid office conversations, we're talking about video enabling every room and getting the cost down so that every room could be a video enabled room. Is this multi-camera thing going to be cost effective for smaller rooms, or is it just a one room in a building type of thing?
If it's going to be successful, I think it needs to be priced at a specific price point. I haven't seen pricing yet on all of the solutions, so I'll hold my opinion there. But I will say that if it's going to be successful and if it's going to be widely adopted, it does need to be a little bit more democratized in its price point. I think that it was Aruna from WebEx actually who said it the best. She said, room and technology needs to be a magnet, not a mandate. And that really just stuck with me. That was the best articulation, I think, by a vendor on why a great technology strategy is so important. And I do think that these new approaches with these multi-cameras is part of that. So it's obviously one of many considerations for back to work strategy. But I think in order to be successful, it's going to have to be priced a certain way.
Well, along that point, though, is multi-camera going to be a solution for home offices as well? Do you think we'll be installing multiple cameras around our desk and turn to camera 2, or is it strictly an office or a meeting room type of thing?
I actually think for the consumer, they're already consuming it. Like, so for example, if you're a content creator, let's say I'm cooking at my kitchen counter, I'll want to have a camera that's pointed at me talking and providing dialogue, and then I want a camera that's pointed at my dish that's showing as I'm preparing a particular meal. So I do think that actually consumer might be a little bit ahead of rooms here, but as far as the information worker at home, gosh, I don't want any more opportunities for people to see how messy my desk is personally. So.
All right, well, that covers 3 stories from Enterprise Connect. I know there's a lot more. We're working on a in-depth report about Enterprise Connect that'll be published, I don't know, maybe a week after they post all the keynotes and all the videos, which is hopefully less than a week away. But
yeah.
But it was a fantastic conference. I'm sure I remember passing you at least once or twice in the halls. It's all a bit of a blur right now. But anyway, thank you for your opinions, Heidi, and thank you for watching.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invite, and we'll catch you again.